I left my cell phone in the car. I started to panic about 5 minutes ago. The kid that grew up in the wilderness is panicking about her phone. No, really it's just the time thing actually, because I'm used to teaching workshops and I always keep track of my own time. So I just need somebody to give me about 20 minutes in and then another when I'm about 10 minutes out. I have a lot to go over with you guys this evening. I'd like to begin with a quote. Very helpful community. I've learned that people will forget what you said. They will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Maya Angelou, author, poet, activist. I love this quote by Maya Angelou because it really speaks to the core of my beliefs about writing. I write to feel. I write to make my readers feel and to have an experience. And if I can leave you guys with anything this evening, I hope it's that you will have a feeling about your own story, about your own life. So, I grew up in the wilderness, some of you know this. Literally 400 acres on an 8,000-foot mountain range, straight out of the 1800s. I learned everything experientially. So I didn't go to school, and I learned mathematics by planting a cornfield with my father and planting rows and rows of cabbages and beans and things like that, and we dug into the dirt and figured out what inches were and how far apart plants had to be spaced. I rode horses. I rode wild horses that my father brought off the reservation, and we trained. And so everything I did was pretty much experiential. So for me up here, having talking at a group of people is an awkward thing. I like to involve people in an experience. I believe that best learning comes from a shared experience. So I'm going to ask you guys if it's okay if I just bring you a little bit into my talk. Are we okay with that? Can I get a sea of hands? There won't be anything too crazy. So, this is awkward. I'm going to move this. I really want to acknowledge Rob for inviting me here. I want to acknowledge him for being such an open heart and really caring about writers, caring about our stories and the potential that we all have. And I felt that in knowing him in the last couple of years. And I'm grateful for his building community and bringing community together. I'm also really grateful for you guys and for your audacity to be writers, to show up and being a writer. Truthfully, I think that being a writer is not an easy path, and I consider it to be the path of being a warrior. You're really blazing trails for people in the world by sharing your life. So thank you for that. I'd like to begin. A lot of my process in my classes has to do with mindfulness. This is how I bring people into the intuitive author and into the internal process of writing, as I use some mindfulness tools. And so if we can begin with a small exercise that just will ground the energy in the room. You're going to take your hand, like this, and we're going to follow along our finger. And you're going to breathe 5 breaths in as you go up the first finger. And then 5 breaths out as you go down the other finger. So breathe in. Let's start again. We'll start 5 breaths in the first finger, 5 breaths in down the other side, 5 breaths in up, and 5 breaths in down. Okay? Henry? And go. You can close your eyes if you like. This is a chance for you to ground your feet on the floor, ground your body to where you are. You feel that? It feels a little different in the room. And tonight I'm going to be going through some little exercises with you like that, and I'd like to nourish you guys with 2 parts of my journey. My first journey in becoming a writer, my hero's journey in becoming a writer, and the second part of how I actually tell story, write a book through the form of hero's journey. How many people in the room have done some work around the hero's journey? Okay, so quite a few of you. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. And so for me, the simple form of explaining what the hero's journey is is that there's a high, and there's some lows, and there's a turning point, and then there's a high point. Okay? Who here has had some highs and lows in their life? And guess what? Highs and lows and turning points make great stories, make great books, make great movies. And the thing about the hero's journey is it's really just about embracing all of that, the highs and the lows. So I'd like to start by telling you my writer's journey. Why I am so excited and love being a writer. Well, I finally feel like I can say that, for one. So it's taken me some years to get to that point, to actually say I'm a writer. I'm living a life of purpose right now. I'm working locally and nationally with a lot of people that are writing books and that have come to me with a lot of resistance and fear and doubt and haven't really even been able to get into their project. And now they're months in to finishing a book and to getting their message out to the world. And the other thing is that I'm a mom. I have a 4-year-old son named Jonah and a 7-year-old daughter named Sophia. And I get to balance my life between being a mother, dropping them at school, being there when they get out of school, really giving a lot of attention to my motherhood time. And also living my purpose, where I get to write daily, I get to use meditation, I get to use mindfulness, and I get to use writing in my daily life. It wasn't always like that for me. So we're going to go through some of my story later. I'm going to break it down for you guys. But I started out, I was raised in the wilderness, so I was born into that. Really no running water, no electricity, in a small cabin that my father built himself. And that was really the only life I knew. And I enjoyed it. I loved being in the woods. I had a donkey named Tawny Jack. And all 6 of us, there were 6 kids in my family, we all climbed on that donkey. He didn't move very fast. He was a pretty slow donkey in the woods. But I had a life of exploration and really a life of freedom in many ways. But there was one big thing that was missing for me, and that was connection to other people. And I really had a longing for that connection. And through some circumstances at the age of 12, I came into the world. And when I first came into the world, I was just trying to fit in, so I was denying most of my past. And I spent a lot of years doing that. Really just trying to, I didn't talk much about my past, and I was really just trying to fit in. Who here at 12 years old was trying to fit in? Anybody? Maybe even 12 and 13 and 14. So for quite a few years. And by the time I got to college, actually, I had only been in school for 6 years when I started at the University of New Mexico. And I really wanted to be a writer. I really wanted to tell my story. But I had some hang-ups. I thought there was this criteria for being a writer. I didn't know what the criteria actually was, but I was sure that I didn't meet the criteria. I came here to SouthWest Writers, actually. I sat over there in the back many years ago, and I sat there thinking, I'm not a writer. I'm not a writer. But if I come here, I will slowly, just by osmosis, it'll just sink into me and I'll be a writer. And so I kept coming, and I kept coming, and finally what happened to me is I had some profound spiritual experiences that really just bolted me into courage. And that courage is what gave me the gumption to start writing my story. I was kind of moving around trying to take some workshops and do a couple of things, but I really wasn't writing. And my courage was stronger than the idea of meeting that criteria to be a writer. And that's how I was on my way. So I took a lot of writing classes. Did anybody take some writing classes with Connie Josephs? Anyone here? Oh, not too many of you. So she taught memoir at continuing ed for many years. So I took a lot of classes with her. And I took a lot of classes with Jennifer Locke. Is anybody familiar with Jennifer Locke? She's a New York Times bestseller of a book called Blackbird. She's written actually 4 successful memoirs just out of her story. Who here knows you can write a lot of books just out of your own story? I know you guys have like 3-4 books in you wanting to come out. So I was in this process of learning what I call the external process of becoming a writer. And that's what I feel is the technical literacy parts of writing, like when we talk about writing in exposition, or we talk about writing in scene. What's your favorite here? Who here likes exposition? Who here likes scene? Oh, we got scene writers. Awesome. So I don't believe there's a right or wrong in any of that, honestly, but it's about really honing your own voice and being able to bring those two things together. So I was learning a lot about the external process of writing, and scene and point of view and voice and theme and all these things that we hear about. But I wasn't producing a lot of material. Does that happen to anybody else? So it was a very slow process. I'd go to writing class, I'd have like 3 pages, I'd work on it all week. I was like, man, 3 pages! It's gonna take me forever to write this book. And then I remember my writing coach, or the writing instructor saying something like, well, you know, there's no award for the amount of rewrites. I thought, wow, this is really gonna take a long time to write this book. So, and then you're back at it, right? Because your courage keeps coming and you keep working at it. So, I just was very frustrated with the fact that I was learning all this stuff, but I wasn't producing a lot of material. And during this time, I started going back up the mountain to where I was born, and I started to work on my relationship with my father that had been broken for many years. And this was part of the story that I was telling. And I went into the woods of my childhood and I started to write. And I wrote amazing, amazing stuff. And I had, for the first time, pages and pages of material. And I really began to do this dance where I would go and I would take a class or I'd take a workshop. I went to the Taos Writers Conference 4 years in a row. I studied under Emily Rapp. Is anybody familiar with Emily Rapp? She wrote The Poster Child. She writes for the New York Times. She's a very, very talented writer. She actually lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And she does do developmental editing. So she's a great connection to have. But I was working with her, and I was working with Jennifer Locke, who's from Oregon, and I was going to the coast of Oregon every August and doing a bunch of workshops. And in between that, I would go back into the woods. And I was kind of in this process of going back into the woods and then coming back into coursework. And I realized that I was connecting more to my intuition on a much deeper level, and that's where my good writing was coming from. And that's why the core of my program is based on connecting to the intuitive author within. So the realization ultimately for me going through this process was that there's an internal process and an external process of writing. And when you bring the two together and you balance the two, is when I feel writing becomes much more easy, it becomes natural, you can write many books this way, it's a flowing process that doesn't feel strained all the time. Does anybody feel strained in their writing? Does anybody feel like they have writer's block? Now and then. So another realization that I had during this time was that when I bring my whole self to my writing, my reader will bring their whole self to the reading. Can you guys say that with me? When I bring my whole self to my writing, my reader will bring their whole self to the reading. Now, how do you bring your whole self to the writing? So that's a lot of my practice, bringing your whole self to the writing. How do we do that? So going inward to connect to the intuitive author within, there are a few things that I believe very strongly will interfere with this process, that will get in the way of this process. And one of them is avoiding pain. So if you try to avoid pain or move around the pain or not acknowledge the pain, I believe that that will interfere with that intuitive process that can just unleash creativity for you. And there are some other things that are connected to pain, and those two things are shame and guilt. So particularly if you're writing memoir, if you're writing nonfiction, these are some elements that come up emotionally for people. Does that resonate with you guys? So going inward and moving through the process of eliminating and moving through the steps of letting go of pain and shame and guilt is a big part of the process that I teach my students. And raise your hand, my students. There's a couple of you guys sitting here, if that helps you to move through those barriers. So So I was in this process, and I was writing, and I was producing a lot of material, and I was getting a book done, and things were moving along pretty smoothly, and then there was an obstacle in my life that happened. Anybody ever experienced an obstacle in the middle of writing a book? And this obstacle was I was in the middle of a divorce. My son was 1 year old, my daughter was 4, and the story is not so much about my divorce, so I don't like to speak too in depth about that. But the whole thing about my divorce is that that was one of the lowest points in my writing process. I actually stopped writing altogether. I became sort of paralyzed. I had moved into a new home and I was starting my life over, but I wasn't writing. I wasn't writing on my book. And I was a large portion of the way through my book, and I had stopped completely. One day I was sitting in my car out in front of a pet store, because I used to go into the pet store to just be around dogs and cats, and it made me feel good during that time. And I got a phone call from one of my best friends, and she started telling me off about the fact that I wasn't writing. I'm like, oh my gosh, who is this mean person, you know? And so she's like, you're a writer, and that is what writers do. They write, no matter what is going on in your life. And I hadn't written anything in 6 months, and she knew that. So she was just letting me know, you know, during crisis, during whatever is going on, during the obstacles, during the resistance, continue to write. That's it. Just continue to write, she said. So that was heavy for me to hear, and I went home and I went to bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night to this strange sound in my room. I'd only been living a couple of months in this new house. I was by myself, and I woke up to this strange sound. Got out of bed. I had like a broom in my house. I had hardly anything to use for protection, and I went into my kitchen to get the broom, and I looked out my back window, and in my neighborhood, I live here in the Northeast Heights, but my neighbor was naked in a tree outside. And I was like, oh my God, is that why I'm awake? What is happening? And he was like so high up in this tree, right? And I couldn't see below his waist, thank God. And it was just like upper body nudity. And he's in this tree, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I'm kind of crouched down in my kitchen watching this for a little bit. And it seems rather harmless. So I watched for a minute, and then I'm like, okay, I am exhausted. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. So I just say, God, if there is a reason I need to be awake, I need you to show me. And I go back into my room, and I flip the light on, and I'm standing there, and I have these long cranberry-colored curtains, and there's a centipede like this long crawling down my curtain. And he comes down the curtain, and he just goes straight for me. So I start whacking that thing with my broom. Has anybody tried to kill a centipede before? It is so ridiculously hard. I was like banging on that thing, my heart rate was through the roof, I'm sweating, and I chopped it in 3 pieces, and it was still moving. And at the end of that, I'm just like, oh my gosh, what was that, what was that? And I come to a calm place, and immediately I think, animal totem, what does this mean? I get on my computer, and I look up what it means to have a centipede coming at you like that. And it says that it's to awaken you out of a paralyzed state. Either physically, mentally, or emotionally. And that was it. I was just like hearing my friend Jenny on the phone earlier telling me that I needed to write. And I got on my computer, and I had been thinking about taking a workshop with Tom Bird. Has anybody heard of him before? Tom Bird he's a book whisperer guy. He basically times you through this rigorous writing process. You write 8 hours, and he keeps track of you. And he really believes that you have a divine author within you, so you're like getting a divine download. And that if you outrun the left brain, this is really his process, if you outrun the left brain, you will stay in the right brain and produce your best material ever. So I was very curious about that, and I had been thinking for a year. I had seen him at a talk like a year earlier, and I had been thinking for a year about doing one of his workshops. So in that moment, I got on the computer, I looked up Tom Bird. His workshops are usually in Sedona, Arizona. And I looked him up, and a month out, 4 weeks from that date, he was doing a workshop in Santa Fe. And I had no money, so I was in the middle of a divorce. And like a huge financial battle. I was divorcing, my ex-husband's from Paraguay, South America. He comes from a very wealthy family, and it was a very hard situation. I'll just say that. And I didn't have any money, but I had a credit card. And so I booked my workshop with Tom Bird. I went to the workshop. It was rigorous. It was 3 days of intense timed writing. Like literally, he times you for 15 minutes is what he does. And you write and you write and you write as fast as you can. And then he times you, and then you take breaks every now and then. And I wrote like 40,000 words that weekend. And I thought, great, I wrote 40,000 words and it's all gonna be crap. But when I went back later and I was reading through it, it was actually really good. And the thing about that process is that it got me back in my writing game. So I was completely committed. I had stepped through a wall of fear and resistance and just feeling like with whatever was going on in my life that I couldn't move through it at the time. And the other thing that happened to me, and this was my big lesson about paying attention to your intuition. Because during that workshop with Tom Bird, I met a man that runs a bunch of webinars. And I don't typically get on the webinars. He was doing them every Saturday. But there was one particular Saturday where my intuition just said, you need to get on this call. I got on the call, and he was interviewing an author out of Canada, Beverly Golden, and she had written a book called Confessions of a Middle-Aged Hippie. And she was very upset about the bad rap that hippie people get and how the hippie movement was very much about organic, growing food organically and being healthy, and it wasn't just a big movement about drugs. And so I had a really great conversation with her, and at the end of the call, she said, I really want to speak to you. And so she called me after the webinar, and she said, I really want you to meet my editor. Her name's Penelope Love. She used to be the editor for the Chicken Soup for the Soul book series, and she works for a really well-known publisher, and I want to introduce you to her. And that's how I met my publisher and my editor, was through that introduction. Later, when I finished my manuscript and my editor read my manuscript, she loved my book and my writing so much that she asked me to go into business with her. All that came from paying attention to my intuition. And so now, today, moving forward, I am in that business partnership, and Penelope and I are changing lives. We're helping people write amazing books and bring their message into the world. And one of those stories happens to be one of my students that's here tonight, Bonnie. Could you stand up, please? Bonnie is... So Bonnie is writing a book. Do you want to tell them what your book is, Bonnie?
My book is about growing up as an at-risk child, high school dropout, smoking, drinking at 11, and then going to law school, but still living a small life. And then I discovered yoga at 50 years old. I was married 25 years to an alcoholic. I did become a lawyer, and then I discovered yoga, and my book is about kind of how the journey that yoga took me on. And I ended my 25-year marriage, got off antidepressants, and then I met Chloe, and then she took me on a even more transformative journey. So that's what the book is about.
And the book is called Excavating Joy, The Archaeology of Love. And Bonnie and I have been working together for a year. She's a lawyer, she has a full-time job, and so through the process that we developed, she was able to set aside the time to actually complete this book. And it'll be finished soon. She'll have a manuscript. And the other thing is, when I was going through that divorce and I started paying attention to my intuition, right? I met Penelope, I went through that whole process, and then there came a time where I had to make a really big decision about whether I was going to go back to work in the career that I was in before I stopped working when I had kids. I was an experiential educator. I used to run a high ropes course and lead adults and young people through leadership course development for personal growth. And I loved doing that work, actually, but the thing is, I wanted to be a writer. And I was in a moment where I had to make a decision about my life. I was either really going to be a writer, I was going to commit to that, and that was going to be a life I was going to lead, or I was going to put writing on the back burner. And I was going to now and then try to pick up my writing, now and then try to finish my book. This was not an opportune time to start a business. But God said to me in that moment, I remember I was sitting in my kitchen alone, and God said to me, you will not only be a writer, but you will lead others to write. You will not only have clients, but you will make amazing connections with amazing people that will make an impact in this world. Since Bonnie and I have started working together, we have developed and taught mindfulness, writing, and meditation to lawyers, if you can believe that. We are certified now to actually help lawyers get their CLE credits by taking mindfulness, writing, and meditation. And that's a movement that we're beginning. We're also in the process of developing an emotional literacy program, we call it, which is bringing mindfulness, writing, and yoga and meditation to kids from middle school throughout. So we're doing some really big things in the world. Thank you, Bonnie. And the statement that I heard from God that night was very true about many of my clients and the connections that I'm making that are happening. I want to talk a little bit about the internal and the external process of writing. How many of you guys here feel like that's true for you? There's the internal and the external. Yeah. So I'm gonna break down the external process of writing on a format of what I call the W, and in a minute we'll put the slides up for that, Kimberly. So we can really nail down what I'm talking about with that, and then we're gonna move through a little bit of an internal process with each of you. And I'd like to share a reading with you before I do that. I want you guys to think for a minute. I want you to think about your highs and your lows and your turning points. If you could just stop for a second while I'm doing this, while I'm getting my writing ready, and I want you to just think about that and write a couple of things down for yourself. It can be any high in your life, any low, and any turning point. This is how you start to understand your own hero's journey. The tricky thing is that there can be so many highs, and there can be so many lows, right? And there can be so many turning points. But again, I trust in this idea of going inward and just pulling something out. What comes onto the page when you think of a high, when you think of a low, and you think of a turning point. Okay. I'm going to read to you guys a piece on why I'm going to trust my writer's voice. I heard this voice some years ago. It rang at my insides, pelted on my backbone like the golf-sized hellballs that came that summer when I was 4 years old. I wasn't scared then, but somewhere over the years, I got scared. Fear came to me like a hungry dog from the streets, always wanting to be fed. I immediately grabbed up everything I had and gave it. This repeated for years. I fought back through the small cracks in the door that brought light. I wrote. I sang. I walked and recited voice to God. The hungry dog was gone. This voice that came was always faithful, truthful, love exposed. I held it dear and developed a practice to learn to trust my voice. I wrote. I sang. I walked and recited life to all things. I'm going to trust my voice because it's the deepest part of my truth, my willingness to see all that can be and to embrace all that has been. Now that is a reason to trust my voice. I would like it if you guys could pair off with someone. This is part of my experiential process. If you could pair off with somebody next to you, and I want you to come up with 3 reasons why you're going to trust your writer's voice and share it with the person. So the gentleman in the back wants me to define the writer's voice. So for me, the writer's voice is this deep internal part of you that you know when you land on the page. It's a connection to your reader. There's a lot of ways to say it, but that's one of the deepest ways for me. Could you repeat that? Bonnie. the deepest part of yourself that you know when you land on the page connects to your reader? Okay, so can I get just a little bit of feedback from you guys? Could somebody tell me one of the reasons they are going to trust their writer's voice? You, Val.
It's the only voice I got.
Yeah.
I can either trust or I can hide from it, but it's what's coming.
That's right. I like that. Thank you. Somebody else?
It's reliable.
It's reliable. Very nice. Yes, sir.
I think you end up having to do that because when you start out writing, you don't have confidence, you may not even have a sense of your own voice. If you're in a critique group, you get a variety of opinions. Someone will say, this is the best thing you've done. Somebody will say, you really missed it here. And they're talking about the same page, the same paragraph.
That's right.
So at some point, you have to determine it by yourself. It has to come from you.
That is a very good explanation of the writer's voice, right? And we've all, I think many of us have been through that experience, so thank you for that example. Yes, somebody here was, yes.
It's not half as profound as
I'm sure it is. We heard your piece a minute ago.
you know, big shoes here, sorry. It's beautiful even when it's tragic.
That's right. That is actually profound and very true, right? And that is part of the hero's journey of embracing that high, the low, the turning point, and then coming back out the other side. It's beautiful even when it is tragic. Yes. What do you have, Henry? You got one?
My voice just hated my writing still out of my head. I don't know where it came from. Mythological muse was sitting on my shoulder.
Yes.
And it's just whatever.
That's right. Thank you. It just poured out. You guys hear that? And the muse was sitting on his shoulder. And he didn't know where it came from. And it just poured out.
Share with Chloe what you said about the fiction being yourself.
I think every fictional writer has a lot of autobiography in it. It may be well besides. It may be a portion of various characters. I've lived along with your slave. So that's what I wanted to do.
That's right. There is a saying, they say there is no such thing as fiction. I don't know if you guys have heard that. Because in one way or another, we are evolving. Being a writer is about evolvement, right? That's why I say we're warriors. Because you take on a lot to evolve yourself as a human being, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. Thank you, Henry. Thank you guys so much for doing that and for giving the feedback. I really love hearing that. Thank you. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to move on to the second portion where we're going to look at my book. And I hope this will be fun for you guys. And we're going to look at it in the hero's journey. And I'm going to have Kimmy put up the W format. There we go. So who here has seen this before? Okay, a few of you. Awesome. So I'm gonna break my book down on this W format, and if you look at it, I might have to pull this off because if you look at it, you can see that it kind of goes through points the way that I described in Hero's Journey, right? We can go high, low, turning point, high, low, turning point, and then come out to the resolution. And everybody's story is going to be a little bit different, right? So we're going to start at the beginning here, and in the beginning, usually the main character is is in bliss state, right? You're opening the story, and everything seems fine, and everything is okay. Doesn't always begin this way, but a large percentage of the time in story and movie, it starts out this way. And I'm actually going to share a piece of writing with you guys that kind of indicates the beginning here. We played with the sun at our backs, the tree branches reaching out to us, the golden earth spinning with shades of green. We played until dusk, where it all faded. The orange ball of fire on the horizon sunk slowly. We were a pack, my siblings and I, living on the edge. Literally on the edge of an 8,000-foot mountain range. Coyote called us into the night. We were a pack, the 6 of us. When the sun went down, we laid down our played-out bodies, fast asleep to a world of dreams. We woke at first sunlight, the streaming golden lines of the sun coming through the cabin windows that had no glass on them. Every day was anew and vibrant. The same colors of the earth were spinning around us, but our hearts were a tiny bit changed by growth, by love, by fear. Mountain lion, bobcat, deer, and coyote roamed the woods. We roamed the woods too, looking for adventure, feeling the soul rise up to meet the mind. Can I get a picture, Kimmy? So this is my pack. That's me in the pink dress wearing the jeans, my oldest brother John, and then the next oldest brother Carrie that's standing in the middle, and my little sister Abigail Rose, and my brother Nye. And the youngest brother of the 6 of us, he's running away in the background if you can see him, and that is Jason. And this is the house that my father built when I was 4 years old. We moved to this property after being refugees for many years where we didn't have a place to live. And then we moved onto this property and there was nothing there at all but total forest and sagebrush field. And we slept outside on the ground for about 6 months into winter under tarps. Okay, let's go back to the W again. So I'm not going to go through every piece of the book because it's going to take too long, but we're just going to try to move through it kind of quickly. So foreshadowing. Everybody here know what foreshadowing is? So in this part of my book, I'm kind of giving some backstory. My parents actually were both raised in the world. My father was on the verge of fame as a musician. He was playing with Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. And my mother was a ballet dancer that had been a ballet dancer for about 15 years. They were a big part of the counterculture movement that happened in 68, 69 in San Francisco. And then they disappeared from society altogether. And so I give a little backstory and then we move further down, and the inciting incident in my story is my older brother dying. And I'm going to read to you guys just a scene. So I'm sure everyone here has heard that if you open a book at anywhere in the book, any scene, any point in the book, you should be able to read it and connect to the voice, right? So I'm just going to read from the middle of a scene. I made my way closer to the box. The adults clamored around me. Voices rose and fell in the air. I could see people's shoes as they walked past me, their coat hems at the sides of their hips. No one noticed me. No one spoke to me. No one offered to hold me. I had learned to count 4 summers ago in the cornfield, and I knew well what a foot was. I stood at the end of the box and set 1 foot in front of the other and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. When I got to 12, my voice trailed off into a whisper. I bent down to the box, tucked my fingers inside the lid, and lifted as hard as I could. Someone grabbed me up from around my waist, and the lid fell shut before I could see anything. I want to see my brother! I want to see my brother! Let me see him! I screamed, kicking my whole body. Grandpa held me tight around my belly till I stopped squirming. Put me down, Grandpa, I demanded, and pried his fingers from my body. You don't need to see him, honey. His body is not the same. He put his hands on my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. John has gone to be with God, dear. Someone called out that the neighbor was bringing his backhoe to dig the grave. I heard the engine plowing its way up the hillside. Everyone stood back. The hole was small, and my father and brothers put their shovels down and let the neighbor dig. The backhoe backed away from what was a very deep hole. The driver cut the engine. People gathered around the space. You were beside us in your box. Dad stood beside the coffin. He held his cowboy hat to his chest. His face was white and his head was shaking. Carrie and I stood next to him. I stood in between my grandparents. Silence grew around us. Grandpa read from the Bible. I don't remember the words. I saw my brothers' faces, their heads bent down in submission to the earth, tears running down the sides of frozen cheeks. We lowered your box into the ground. Men grabbed up shovels and started to throw dirt over the top. I hadn't forgotten about the cherry pie. I watched the dirt cover over your box. Snowflakes fell onto the dirt, white on top of brown. Drifting snowflakes fell softly, till someone ushered me away from the sight. Can I have the picture again? That's me and my brother. I'm about 1.5 years there, and he was about 6.5. And apparently he carried me around everywhere, is what my mother said. Okay, let's go back to the W. Okay, so after the inciting incident comes the first plot point where everything changes. So in my book, we look at all the main characters, including myself, and how everything shifts after that point. And then we start with our response to all the changes. And so you keep moving up the response, and you go through a struggle. And in my case, there were many different struggles, and I'm not allowed to reveal everything because my publisher will actually kill me. And she's going to watch this video, so. I love you, Penelope Love. She's like, don't read that. So I'm trying to balance between connecting with you guys and not giving my entire story away. So you going through a struggle, and then you come to the midpoint of your story. And the midpoint of my story is where some very traumatic events happen, and that is how I actually end up leaving my childhood home. And then coming down the other side of understanding, I'm actually in the world, and I'm living in the world, and I think that things are going to be okay. But then I get placed in a foster care home, and that's down in the corner here where we have All Hope is Lost. And I actually have a very good memory. In my book, I can write about every single sunset practically in my childhood, or sunrise, or the tree branches that I passed walking through the woods, or every single chicken that I had, every goat that I had, every horse that we had. I have an impeccable memory. And at this point in my story, where all hope is lost, I have very little memory, and I'm 12 years old. I went into a foster care home with a woman that was really taking my sister and I in just for the money, and I was separated from my brothers. So I had my 3 brothers. They went into foster care as well, but they were separated from us. And I vaguely remember being in that place. My second plot point comes, and this is when there's a final twist in the story. I make a phone call to my older brother, and I'm crying on the phone, and I say, "You have to get us out of here. This woman is very mean, and you have to get us out of here." And my brother makes a really big decision in his life at 15 years old. And that's my second plot point. That you'll have to read the book to get. So, and then, okay, so then the rest is I continue to adapt living in the world and everything else that is going on with me. And here we have the hero is in charge, right? So the hero has finally got the grasp of what's going on internally, externally, and they're able to start making decisions about their life and really honing in a way that feels like they have some control over their life. And as you're moving, you can see there where it says the hero's in charge. As you're moving through that, the whole process of that is about overcoming inner demons. Who here has heard that when you're writing a book that the stakes need to be really high? It needs to be about life or death. Right? It's either a psychological, an emotional, or a physical actual death. So in my case, I had both the risk of the psychological and the physical. Growing up, my father didn't believe in doctors. I survived some pretty intense injuries, as well as did my brothers, in which we did not have any medical care, and he treated us himself. There was a lot of inner demons for me to overcome, and a lot of it had to do with the understanding the world that I grew up in, and then understanding the world that I live in, which is the culture that we know, the society that we live in. And honestly, I'm still trying to understand that, especially right now. So, I mean, this is a really good time for me actually writing this book because there's a lot going on culturally, and my father was very much anti-government and very much the establishment, and that was a big part of why he took this stance against the world and raised me the way he did. He did not want me to be indoctrinated by the world. He was very well educated himself. He went to an elite private school growing up, the same school that the Bush kids went to. He was voted to be the next president of the United States in his high school yearbook. And he lived a majority of his life out in the wilderness. Can I show a picture of my father? So there's my father, Jerry Gallaway is his name, and he is riding Juniper. And Juniper was a wild Mustang that came off the Hickory Apache Reservation, and he was literally starved to death. So my father did a lot with horses. He brought them in, he trained them, and he made them whole. And that was a big part of my experience growing up. I'd like to read you guys just a final piece. Like that. Wild horses. My father began his love of horses young. He had been going to visit his grandmother and grandfather Jewel and Lonnie Baxter on their ranch in Clovis, New Mexico, since he was a kid. He spent most of his time in the inner city where his father had gone from being a judge to becoming a Christian minister. Ira still wore the cloak of the law, but now he wore it with the larger purpose of a Christian movement. My father's summers were spent helping his grandfather herd thousands of cattle by horseback across the dry desert lands. He loved the vastness of the land, and his grandfather was a gentle leader. When he left the world, he left all that was offered to him in the world, but he had taken with him his ability to connect with the wild bronco of the West. Living in northern New Mexico gave lots of opportunity to train and ride wild horses. He rode on horseback all over the San de Cristo Mountains for hundreds of miles into hundreds of sunsets and sunrises. Some of the years were before my birth, but I didn't miss anything because he told me the stories of being in the wild with little food, little supplies. Some of these trips were with John and Carrie and my mother. The ballet dancer was now a horsewoman. I'm not sure my mother loved the stories as much. She seemed to fade away into the kitchen when he talked about them. The true cowboy in the room was my father, wild like the horse, sincere in his best moments, strong in his will, and fiery in his conviction. I think my mother wanted a soft place to lay her head and her heart. Cowboys can sleep on rocks on the ground and get up and keep riding. I admired my father and thought I might be so tough as to sleep on rocks too. My brothers sure were, and they proved it every day by being as dangerous as they could. They ran the cliffside that outlined the hundreds of wilderness. They rolled huge boulders off the cliff and followed the trails off 1,000-foot drops. They were like mountain goats with sure footing and big grins on their faces while they ran. They helped my dad to train horses by throwing on motorcycle helmets and hopping on a wild bronco only to be tossed into midair, sometimes landing on their butts and sometimes on their feet. Nye was much more shy than John and Carrie, but he learned to be strong inside his smaller body and rode with them, did everything they did. He was like David in the story of David and Goliath. Nye was kind and sensitive, but when it came time to cowboy up, he was the first one to get on the horse. It was a boy's world. I spent a lot of my time watching and building strength in my mind on how I would be a champion in a boy's world. Thank you guys for hearing that. I just want to leave you guys with 2 questions. And I want to ask you, where are you at with your intuitive author within? And what does your hero want from you moving forward? I'm going to go ahead and take the next 10 or so minutes for questions or comments. And at the same